that enough times and no parent will buy you anything.
That's true. And that's a perfect place to begin. Welcome to the Big Questions podcast, where we talk about love, death, sex, religion, and all the big questions worth asking. I'm your host, Robert K. Eldrin. Today we're talking with Steve Darnall. He's the publisher and editor of Nostalgia Digest and the host of Those Were the Days on WDCB in Glen Ellyn. And he'll be at the Ela Township Community Center in Lake Zurich on Tuesday, January 28th at noon. And what are you going to talk about, Steve?
It's a presentation about radio and the Great American Songbook.
Oh, very cool.
So it's a chance to talk about the evolution of that and also feature some radio performances from the likes of Cole Porter and Johnny Mercer and George Gershwin.
Oh, very cool. And the Big Questions podcast is sponsored by Shure, purveyors of professional microphones and headphones. You can check them out at shure.com. That's SHURE.com. And the Big Questions is also part of the Sun Times Media Local Podcast Network. So, Steve, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to begin provocatively, and that is, so you're editor of Nostalgia Digest. I'm just wondering, is or can nostalgia be dangerous? Is it a dangerous thing to look back with, a rosy hue?
I think like a lot of drugs, if used in moderation, it can probably be very helpful, and if used excessively, it can cause disorientation, and you kind of lose track of where you are. Chuck Shaden, who started the Nostalgia Digest and Those Were the Days, always had a good quote, which I've lived by, which is, we're living with the past. We're not living in it. I think it is a real danger to live in the past because, as the saying goes, nostalgia is never what it used to be.
Right.
And, we can talk about growing up in the 70s or 80s, and yeah, I'm sure from my point of view as a 10-year-old kid in the suburbs of Grange, it might have seemed idyllic, but, I wasn't the one who had to pay the bills, and I wasn't that person in the 1950s who got cancer and as a result of getting cancer automatically died.
Right.
And I think in some degree we've seen a rather dangerous extension of that, and I wouldn't necessarily chalk it up to nostalgia per se, but we've seen so much antagonism following the election of an African-American president. And I don't want to imply that people who are opposed to the president are racist.
Sure.
That's not the point. But you can tell from hearing from some people, they are kind of thinking, why can't it be the way it used to be? And implicit in that is, when the black people knew their place.
Yeah. And
that's unfortunate. But I think there is a lot to be gained from nostalgia. I mean, I think it was the University of Southampton who actually did research, and it's fairly tentative, but the idea of flashing back on good times in your life or in the world, that it actually can improve well-being, that it can increase self-esteem, and at its best, I think, it encourages us to hopefully try new experiences and seek out new experiences because we realize that from those experiences come the memories we have years later.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're more forward-thinking. Like I love that point of view, but I think, and I think we both know people like this who are just stuck in whatever decade or sort of whatever. We know the same people who have the same record collections. Like they just stopped at like age 25, and now it's Jethro till the grave.
Yeah. Or for that, to take that the extra extension, the people who will only play 78s,
yeah.
who will only, who still wear, who insist on dressing up in raccoon coats with straw boaters and a pennant that says "Ra,"
Well, I'm just worried about the logical extension of that because, God forbid I end up in a nursing home. Like, are they going to can you put on Metallica's "Kill 'Em All"? That's right. That really soothes them.
That's right. Before he goes in for the hernia operation, could you put on some death metal? That would be great.
There's the Nirvana. They love Teen Spirit. Put that on before they go to bed, right at pudding time.
Well, I'm sort of trying to catch. I think it's a mistake to give up on the present. I think one advantage, one of the epochal years of my life was 1977, because at the beginning of that year I was 12 years old, and I had discovered the golden age of radio with Chuck Shaden and the Those Were the Days program. At the end of that year, I saw Elvis Costello on Saturday Night Live, and it was really, looking back, it was like a watershed for me, because one of those things taught me, don't disregard the past because it's past. And the other taught me, don't disregard the future because it could be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And those were two very important lessons to learn, and something that certainly as a 12-year-old I wasn't cognizant of, and most 12-year-olds probably aren't. But it was important to realize that there was so much to find. You know, it's like the saying, you know, most of us listen to music from the past because there's more of it.
Right. Or there was more of us. You know, we have early formative memories. I think that's part of it. But, you know, you've curated, you know, all of these sort of amazing programs. Burns and Allen, you know, the Jack Benny Show, you know, many, many more. Those are the famous ones. And, you know, I sort of made a joke, which is true, which is you spent more time listening to dead people than, you know, than Haley Joel Osment in The Sixth Sense. And so my question is, like, you know, what have you learned listening to all of those hours of old radio broadcasts?
To be really pretentious about it, I suppose, the sense that I'd like to think of it as inexpensive time travel, that you learn something about the time in which it was produced, whether it was, you know, how people lived, how they bought their cigarettes and their soap, what they thought was funny and entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that humor from 60, 70, 80 years ago has not aged especially well.
Mm.
Some of it has aged beautifully.
And what ages well and what doesn't?
Well, obviously, the comedians who relied on topical humor are at something of a disadvantage. The Bob Hopes of the world, Fred Allen, who was a brilliant satirist, but he got a lot of his jokes, a lot of his humor, by parodying the current trends of the society.
Right.
And of course, those are the trends of 1945. Some of them stay with us today. I mean, he parodied game shows in the 1940s, which really sort of, you know, never goes out of style. Saturday Night Live still does it, I think, even though there aren't many game shows left.
Right.
And so, and to some degree, there's that. Obviously, the folks who came out of the minstrelsy tradition, the dialect comedians, they may be less vital in terms of understanding modern humor than they are fascinating in terms of understanding the ethnic makeup of the United States in the 1930s and 40s.
And what was permissible? That's the other thing.
That's true.
You know?
That's true. You know, and this is where we get back to what we were talking about earlier, that it's a real mistake to disregard something modern for the sake of it, because, you know, in a way, radio in particular expanded the horizons of everyone who listened to it, not just in the sense that it was a theater of the mind, which is already pretty impressive, that when you realize what radio drama could do, but also in the sense that the technology eventually took us around the world. It took us to Europe for the war. It took us into the Philippines during the war. Eventually we could hear live broadcasts from parts of the world that many of us a century ago didn't even know existed. Or if we did, we assumed it was some, you know, desolate backwater, you know. And as a result, when you learn more about the other cultures, be it someone in Chicago learning about Mississippi, or someone in Mississippi learning about Africa or Asia, it's going to change how you think about those cultures and how you think about those people. And as a result, you're right, the ethnic humor probably became less tolerable as it became apparent that, you know, not all African Americans talked like Amos and Andy,
Right.
you know, and not all Jewish people talked like Molly Goldberg.
Right. Well, and you know, it's been pointed out before, but you know, the Rat Pack stuff with Sammy Davis Jr.
Mm-hmm.
You know, much of the live Vegas shows that were just released on CD in the last decade or so, they're making light of the fact that he's just on stage with them, and then they perform "Me in My Shadow," which is a little cringeworthy, and that's actually more modern than some of the shows. So it's really interesting to see how that dynamic changes, and I'm interested, going back to sort of our core question about nostalgia, and for you, what's the difference between sentimentality and nostalgia?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. Nostalgia, I've always sort of rather flippantly described as something that used to be one way and now it isn't. The sentimentality, obviously, can be part and parcel of that. But, as we've said, I don't think any of us look back at the 1950s as a golden age of cancer.
Yeah.
To give an example, I think sentiment is valuable because it reminds us, I think, at the heart of who we are. I think it's the reason that all of us flock to A Christmas Carol every year, whether it's the stage show or the movies, or, virtually every year on Those Were the Days, we play a production of A Christmas Carol, usually with Lionel Barrymore, who did Scrooge for so many years. And I think the thing about that story that works so beautifully is the sentiment, because at its heart, it tries to remind us that all of us have the capacity to be better than we can be. In Scrooge's case, it was a very extreme example. But having said that, there is a lot about the golden age of radio that's fascinating historically. That, I think it's, and I think too, it's possible to be sentimental for a time that wasn't automatically great. We see that all the time. And, it's possible to look back on some outdated form of humor, like the Yiddish humor or the ethnic humor or the hillbilly humor, and sort of shake our heads and, oh man, what were you guys doing? But at the same time, there is a temptation to think, gosh, it must have been nice to be not inundated with stimulus from all around the world.
Yes, it's just a much different culture, and I think maybe that's one of the things that you've sort of, again, been an archivist for, is this, like, listen, this was a mass medium. Everybody listened to this. This was a cultural touchstone. It's a good point. And the point is that it was the first mass medium, and people were still feeling their way. You know what I mean? And so to be in Chicago, for instance, where Freeman Gosden and Charles Correll created Amos and Andy, well, that was amazing. And it took some time for them to realize, hey, this could be a national phenomenon instead of a local one. And then over time, they realized, hey, this might actually not be quite as funny as we think it is. Yeah. Well, and we mentioned this before we started recording, but Chicago native and writer Peter DeVries famously said, nostalgia isn't what it used to be. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that nostalgia is a moving target depending on which generation you are, and as generations get older. And so my question is, you have Nostalgia Digest, and a lot of that is radio focused and early Hollywood focused. Mm-hmm. But is there a time when Nostalgia Digest has Led Zeppelin on the cover?
No. For one thing, Led Zeppelin's been pretty well covered.
Sure.
And I don't want to. I want to give Jan Wenner a break. I think Rolling Stone deserves a leg up.
Yeah.
They must be able to do. No,
he appreciaes your mercy.
I'm sure, because I'd squash him like a bug. I would. No, I'm kidding, Jan. Really. I think those bands, that era, has been so chronicled, by Rolling Stone, by the music magazines, by the news magazines, that, the world does not need me to come up with another story about the Beatles or Neil Diamond or Easy Rider.
Right.
Which is fine.
But we're getting to a point now where even like the 80s are nostalgia. Because we have, now it's going to be 4 Transformers films, that those are 30-year-old toys. And now, superhero movies are the big summer tentpole movies. those characters were created in the 40s and in the 60s for Marvel. So it's interesting how we're sort of surrounded by this. I talked to Stan Lee years ago about this, and he said, no, it was all inevitable. You just had to wait for the technology to catch up to the imaginations of the writers. And so, like, that makes sense in a sort of a telegraph thing, because you end up with the people who grew up with the Fantastic Four and X-Men now being in charge of studios.
Right.
But again, you have Alan Moore, a famous comic book writer. He wrote The Watchmen and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, kind of saying, you know what, superheroes are a damaging cultural paradigm. It's an idiom that doesn't work anymore.
And I'm going to answer this in a way that probably gets back to sentimentality, is I think it depends on the ones you're talking about. Certainly, I have very little patience for some of the upgrades, and I'm putting that in quotes, that superheroes have gone through in recent years. I haven't, and in fairness, I haven't probably bought a comic book in 10 years at the least.
Yeah, Man of Steel is not going to make you happy, by the way.
No,
okay.
I'm not sure it made anyone happy, did it? Except,
did you see it?
No.
Yeah, it's not going to make you happy.
No, I figure, I can snap my neck on my own time.
Yeah, but it's also, but the other thing that's, and again, no further spoilers here, but the fact that
did I ruin it for you? Good.
The fact that the fact that you have Russell Crowe riding a pterodactyl in the first 5 minutes, I'm like, when? I don't remember Avatar being in Superman.
I think, you talked about whether nostalgia could be a dangerous thing, and it certainly can if you want to live in the past, if you want to pretend that, compact discs don't exist, and that, cigarettes don't give you cancer or any of those things. But in terms of the heroes, it was a vastly different thing. I think any of us, I know last year we actually played some Superman on our radio show, and it was interesting to just hear him be a hero. There was no inner dialogue. There was, he was just doing the good thing because it had to be done.
Marshall McLuhan was not in the room. No one was being deconstructed yet.
No, nothing like that. So, anyway, I've sort of gone off the point of the question.
No, and that is just nostalgia as a moving target.
It is interesting. I mean, it is interesting to hear an oldies station that's playing Dire Straits. I will say that, because I like a lot of people my age, probably, I look, wait, that's old?
Yeah.
I can't be old. I listened to that when I was in college.
Or the fact that, there's a refrain in Money for Nothing that Sting sings, and I'm not going to repeat it. No, does he sing it? No.
Yeah,
about somebody being gay, basically.
No, that's Mark Knopfler.
That's Mark Knopfler, which is not kosher. Like, now that is hard to listen to.
Well, and I think,
groundbreaking video, groundbreaking song, now kind of hard to make palatable.
Well, it's interesting, and it was sort of one of the last times that character-based songwriting ended up on the charts. People writing a character like Randy Newman does. I mean, obviously, Mark Knopfler is not a homophobe, as far as I know. There's no evidence.
But it was culturally acceptable for him to say that on
a national. You're right, on a top 10 hit.
Yeah.
No, that's true. That has changed. A lot has changed, and I've not experienced anybody being overly sensitive where those things are concerned. I should say that. I'm sure that such a thing exists, but coming from my background, I'm not in a position to tell people what should and shouldn't offend them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I was going through the Atheist Bible, which is the Bartlett's quotation dictionary, and a couple of quote books. And one of the things that I dug up was Milan Kundera, who wrote Unbearable Lightness of Being and Immortality, and he describes nostalgia as a suffering caused by an unappeased yearning to return. Fair or unfair?
I'm not sure if suffering is the word exactly, but like I say,
yearning maybe.
A yearning, I think that's legitimate. Because like I say, I mean, I'm listening. I have a radio show that plays shows from 60 and 70 years ago. I wasn't there. I have no firsthand knowledge of what these shows were like. But you're right. There's something enormously appealing about them. And and then in turn, to hear people talk about being alive during that time and hearing these shows for the first time, yeah, there's something about it that thinks, gosh, you make it sound wonderful when you describe it. And of course, the people who do that, they might leave out something very, very important, like, yes, it was but by the way, it was World War II, and we all had blackouts, and
Yeah, people are actively raising war bonds.
Yes, and we had to actually be careful around anybody who had an Asiatic countenance because we thought they might be spies.
Yeah.
There is some of that, but I think there is still something about it that, hearing the stories about people who would sit around the radio and listen as a family, and you do think, well, there's something to that. Maybe we can't sit around the radio like they did 70 years ago, and maybe we don't want to, but hopefully there's something you can grab from that and bring with you into the present. Whether it's something, usually a simple thing, a simple courtesy, even if it's just knowing who your next door neighbors are and, offering to wash their house while they're away, because that's what people did 70 years ago when they had a neighborhood and it worked fine.
Right. Well, what was the in listening to these shows, we were talking before about what the people on those shows were nostalgic for. Can you talk about that? Because I want to drop some of that audio in.
It is interesting because, even in the 1930s and 40s, we have to remember, like anything else, there was a previous generation that had a voice of their own. And, there were people who grew up, who listened to radio, who must have been not only astonished by the technology of radio, but had been astonished by a lot of technologies, air travel and automobile travel. And it's interesting because in the 1940s, and the one that comes to mind is that Bing Crosby was the star of the Kraft Music Hall, and every week for at least one season, they would do a little feature called Time Marches Back. And so they would do a couple of songs from, say, 1925 or 1918, and maybe do a little sketch.
Time marches back. 1918. Food Administrator Hoover decrees wheatless and meatless days to help win the war to end war. 1918. Consumers gasp as egg prices soar to 57 cents a dozen. 1918. And on Wednesday evenings in the parlor, young men can be heard saying to their girls,
Electricity's a wonderful thing, ain't it?
In what way, Harry?
Well, you can just walk into a room and turn it on, or you can turn it out.
Oh, what's wonderful about turning it out?
I'll turn it out and show you.
And it was interesting, you're right, that even in the 30s and 40s, people had a yearning to go back to simpler times. Mm-hmm. And ironically, I think radio could be a double-edged sword in that regard, because radio taught us more about the world than anything else had done prior to it. It took us to Germany, and it took us to the death camps in Buchenwald. It took us to the fighting in Manila. It also took us to, United Nations events happening all over the world, and the coronation in England. And there were probably people who thought, wow, this is so much information to take in. It was so much simpler when the newspaper came out once a week, and we all just, it's our town. Thornton Wilder is probably the best example. At the very end, Emily Webb wants to go back. She wants to go back to one day of her life. And it's beautiful, but it's also heartbreaking, because you realize that one day you go back to, it'll never be enough. Right. To have that one memory, well, that just makes you crave the other memories all the more.
I was going to say that's the exact ending of Spielberg's and Kubrick's AI as well. Mm-hmm. Is he gets to live one day with his mother.
Wow, sure.
It seems to be across genres. But you said something, and excuse me for interrupting, but you said something about again what those folks were nostalgic for, including interviews, and they did interviews with. Well,
in fact, yeah, we were talking about this before we started recording. A couple of years ago, we did a show about the Civil War to commemorate the sesquicentennial of that. And there were various history-based radio programs at that time, like the Cavalcade of America and You Are There, which purported to do a sort of live breaking news report of the surrender at Appomattox. There was also an experimental show on CBS, the Columbia Workshop. And a lovely gentleman, Norman Corwin, got a real big start on that show. But in 1939, they did a show for Remembrance Day, which had yet to become Memorial Day, about a retired Union soldier. And the play was about 20 minutes long. And in the last portion of the show, they presented a live remote broadcast from a Confederate nursing home. And they spoke with soldiers who had fought for the Confederacy in the war.
We're going to hear from some of these men now as they chat with another of WRVA's representatives, Randolph Saunders.
Thank you, Jeff. And first, let's chat with John Shaw. Howdy, Mr. Shaw.
Howdy, John.
Mr. Shaw, how old are you, sir?
104.
104. And when were you born?
1835.
And I believe you said the month of February.
February the 6th.
That's splendid, and you certainly don't look your age. This
Well,
climate certainly agrees with you, Mr. Shaw.
I feel it.
With whom did you serve during the war, Mr. Shaw?
What?
With whom did you serve during the war?
I served up Stewart.
The cavalry leader.
Yeah.
And what was your opinion of General Stewart?
Stewart was a fine man.
And you fought all through the war
Yeah.
for 4 years.
Oh, yeah.
Admittedly, they didn't get into the big issues of was this moral, was this right, because for one thing, it was over. And all these gentlemen must have been 90 if they were a day. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you something, we normally, when we play a show on Those Were the Days, our mics are off, and different things happen. We'll either check our notes for what we're playing next, we'll go out, grab a drink of water or whatever. And while this was playing, I came out and I saw the volunteers, the folks who answer our phones, and all of them were huddled around the radio. Because, my gosh, how often are you going to hear from gentlemen who were born in 1840? Mm-hmm. That was, or 1850 for that matter. It was just an incredible, incredible idea. And the fact that it exists, and this is why I can't really give nostalgia a bum rap ultimately, because it inspires people to seek these things out. And in turn, you're going to find some amazing diamonds among the stones, I mean, it may be something that you just stumble upon, as I stumbled upon that. But it might also be, hearing shows where George Gershwin is the star. I mean, George Gershwin's died in 1937. There is not a lot of evidence of what he sounded like, but we have some, and it's thanks to radio.
I want to push this forward just a little bit, and that is, we touched on it, but, what are you nostalgic for?
I've always...
So child of the 70s.
Child of the 70s, yeah, I was going to say, I can't imagine, I certainly don't go back and think, oh, if only we had platform shoes again. Boy, for one thing, I don't need them. I'm like 6.5 feet tall. I don't necessarily think, wow, I wish, I wish all the women I knew would wear satin dresses again, or polyester.
That'll come back.
Yeah, it may. Well, in a way, and I've always felt a little out of time in that sense, in that I end up being nostalgic for things I didn't experience. But, having said that, you look back and you certainly have fond memories. A lot of them are memories of a first-time experience. We were talking about Alan Moore, the writer of Watchmen and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And I remember I had gotten into comics actually fairly late. Not until college did I start reading them really seriously. And everybody was abuzz about this guy, Alan Moore, writing Swamp Thing. And I remember the first time I read that, and it's like, wow, I see what they mean. It was like the first time you discover Love and Rockets by the Hernandez brothers. The first time I heard Elvis Costello perform on Saturday Night Live, the first time I heard Fibber McGee and Molly on Those Were the Days. I have fond memories of collecting baseball cards as a young man.
It's really, really interesting that there's such a vast chasm between Fibber McGee and Alan Moore. Like that's the thing that's really amazing is that we can sort of have that sort of time warp in our brain and both things are appealing.
And I think that's the beautiful thing about the digital age. I mean, I remember, I will say this, I've very specific memories in the 70s of hearing Fibber McGee and Molly and falling in love with the golden age of radio and all that came with it, which were the shows and the movies and the bands that played, Glenn Miller and Harry James. But there were certainly musicians whose work had fallen out of public favor. And if you wanted to find a collection of, say, Harry James or somebody even more obscure like Clyde McCoy, who performed the Sugar Blues, you really had to dig. And maybe the library had something, and of course, if they did, it was probably scratched to pieces. Now, in a digital age, it's amazing because conceivably it's all there, and I've encountered this with young people, college-age people, who they may be big fans of the White Stripes, but they may also be big fans of Led Zeppelin, who broke up 15 years before any of them were born.
Right.
And subsequently, they may be huge fans of Howlin' Wolf. And where that comes from, who knows? And there are so many ways to learn so many things now that it's really fascinating and very encouraging because, it means that they then may take the step and think, well, if I like, the Rolling Stones, maybe I should go back and listen to Ray Charles and Louis Jordan, and it's right there.
Well, our lives become a Pandora channel, basically.
Yes, and yes, if you decide one day I want to hear the Smiths, it's there. If you decide 1 hour later, oh, that was great. Now for the Bye Bye Birdie soundtrack,
right?
And it's there. And then to think, yes, now for Bing Crosby and the Rhythm Boys from 1931, that's there.
Well, you said something that's very, very interesting that I want to come back to, and that is that you are nostalgic for things you didn't experience. What are you talking about?
I don't know. I suppose in the sense that listening to these radio shows, it certainly made me think, boy, it'd be fun to go back and, be in the audience of a Fibber McGee and Molly show, or be in the audience for a Songs by Sinatra program, so you could watch the Bobby Soxers squeal on cue.
And get paid for it.
Well, some of them, yeah, that's right. Although I have to say, my mother-in-law grew up in Brooklyn in the 40s, so she has memories of seeing Sinatra play, and every time we play one of his shows, I always think about that. And that's the good kind of sentiment. That's the good kind of nostalgia, I think. The sense that here's this fellow who didn't know me, didn't know my mother-in-law, but he planted a seed that has stayed in my mind ever since, and since her passing. For me, there is the sense of seeing a Cary Grant, and I'm certainly not the first person to admire the work of Cary Grant, and then to think, gosh, wouldn't it be great to be that suave, to be that talented, to be that stylish, to have all that going for him without, what appeared to be no real negative repercussions. I mean, certainly some stars from that era we know met tragic ends, and I would not encourage that for anyone.
Or even Dino, the book by Nick Tosches about Dean Martin. Few people cooler than Dean Martin seemed to not have a very good life. He was sort of a loner, ate alone. It's one of those things that, we love the public persona, but I think, in the post age of the true Hollywood story, there's so many similarities.
Oh yeah, and there's things that are important to know, and things that probably in retrospect aren't. I know when I took over as publisher of the Digest in 2005 that I had met an author who was, I don't know if well known is the phrase, but he had made his name by writing biographies of Hollywood stars from this era, mostly involving their sexuality. And, like everybody else, there's something about that can intrigue you on some level, but it should not be what it's about. I really... I don't care if this starlet was secretly a lesbian. It doesn't matter, good, bad, or otherwise, to what I'm seeing.
Sure. Or to the performance.
Exactly.
It matters culturally, but not to the
Well,
performance.
of course, and yes, it would have been tremendous if a gay or lesbian actress in the 30s had the ability to speak out the way a gay or lesbian performer does today.
Yeah, but it made Garbo miserable.
Is that right?
Oh, awful. She was in love with a woman who married someone else.
Yeah, and that, like I say, that's interesting, and yes, there's something fascinating about the salacious, of course, and there always has been, but it's not ultimately important to your enjoyment of the work, whether Sinatra drank, whether this person was in a terrible marriage or this person was in a great one. Yes, you can see the parallels there. I suppose you could look, for instance, at Bela Lugosi's appearance in Bride of the Monster, and knowing what you know about his life, you could think on one hand, wow, you're doing an Ed Wood film. That is as far down the ladder as you're going to get. And on the other hand, you can think, but you probably had a lot of pain to draw on in this performance, and it's fascinating. And I'm getting way off the subject now.
That's all right. No. I think that we are dead on the subject because we are mired in sort of a omni-pop cultural era because we can draw on all these things, and I think you're right. I think knowing all of these things adds depth, but sometimes you want a song just to be a song. Exactly.
Well, and a good example, we have done over the 9 years I've been publishing Nostalgia Digest, we did one in 2007, we did one last year, but I've done 3 swimsuit issues. Because, for one thing, I thought, why should Sports Illustrated have all the fun? But also because it was a reminder that the biggest product Hollywood was selling was Hollywood. The idea that, somebody who was singing in a chorus line in Altoona, Pennsylvania, could be plucked from obscurity and come out to this land of sunshine and palm trees, and they could be in the most stylish clothes while they're on the movie set, and when they're done, look at them. They're at their swimming pool. Mm-hmm. And of course, yes, they've been dolled up to the nines by stylists and photographers and all that. But they made it look so interesting and so appealing and so fun, to find these photos of, Vera Ellen just, wrestling with the beach umbrella. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's staged, but it's beautifully staged. And
it's probably pretty modest by, modern standards. That's the other thing.
Very much so.
Yeah, she's wearing like a burqa, right?
A lot of one pieces,
yeah.
and of course they had that sort of extra, and I'm not good at describing the fashion, but that extra fabric that sort of came down over the thigh.
Right.
So yeah, there was nothing high cut in those days, and those people, I think many of them they wanted nothing more than to advertise their product, which was themselves and their community.
Yeah. You've been listening to the Big Questions podcast. It's part of the Sun Times Media Local Podcast Network. Our music is by Hernan Sanchez. Our guest has been Steve Darnall.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.
Hey, Bud. Bud.
Huh?
Got a match?
Match? Yes, I have one right here.
Don't make a move. This is a stick-up.
What?
You heard me.
Mister, put down that gun.
Shut up. Now, come on. Your money or your life? Look, Bud. I said your money or your life. I'm thinking it over.